The sheriff's men arrived before the frost had lifted from the grass, which meant Clara Voss saw their long coats. First, two dark shapes moving through the white morning like crows crossing a field, before she understood what they were carrying. She was standing barefoot on the porch because she had heard the creak of wagon wheels on the frozen road and come out without thinking, without shoes, without the presence of mind, to be afraid. The October cold came up through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet, and she stood there and watched the men approach and felt the cold move up through her ankles and into her shins, and still she did not move. The taller man hammered the notice to the door with 3 strokes. Clean, practiced, efficient. He had done this before. The second man held the horse's bridle and looked at a point somewhere above Clara's head, the way people look when they are embarrassed by a task they have chosen not to refuse. The taller man stepped back, assessed the notice on the door with the brief satisfaction of a craftsman checking his work, and then looked at Clara for the first time. His expression was not cruel. That was the thing she would remember later, the absence of cruelty. It was simply the face of a man completing a transaction. She read the notice the way her mother had taught her to read anything that mattered, slowly from the beginning, without skipping ahead to the parts that frightened her. The paper said the land belonged to Granger County now. It said the taxes owed by her late father, Thomas Voss, exceeded the assessed value of the property. It said Sheriff Dale Mercer of Granger County, Tennessee, held the legal authority to seize and auction the 40-acre parcel, including the house, the barn, the smokehouse, and all structures thereon. It gave her until sundown. She read every word. She did not cry. When she reached the last line, she folded the notice along its original crease carefully with both hands and put it in the pocket of her dress. She had not yet decided why she kept it. Some instinct told her that a piece of paper with her family's name on it was still in some way hers, the last document in the world that acknowledged the Voss family had existed here, had owned something, had mattered to the county's ledgers, even if only as a debt. The taller man said she had until sundown. She nodded. He said it again, perhaps because she had not spoken, and she nodded again, and eventually the 2 men got back on the wagon and the horse pulled them away down the dirt road, and she stood on the porch alone with her feet going numb and the notice in her pocket and the sound of the wagon fading into the white morning. She did not look at the dogwood trees lining the front path. She knew they were there. Her mother, Eleanor, had planted them the year Clara was born, working through August heat to set each sapling at exactly the distance from the others that she had read about in a gardening pamphlet sent from Nashville. Eleanor Voss had been a woman who believed in doing things correctly when the correct method was available, and she had spaced those 12 dogwood trees with a measuring rope and a care that struck the neighbors as excessive. By the time Claire was old enough to notice them, the trees had grown tall enough to arch over the path, and in spring they bloomed white, and the path looked like something from a different world, a gentler, ordered world where things were tended and remained. She did not look at the trees because she knew that if she looked at them, she would fall apart, and she did not have time to fall apart. Thomas Voss had died in February when the cold had come down from the ridge line and settled into the hollow like something that intended to stay. He had been coughing since November, the kind of cough that starts small and polite and then grows until it owns the room, until the walls of the house seem to vibrate with it at night. And Clara would lie in her bed listening and counting the seconds between each spasm, the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder to measure a storm's distance. By January, the cough had a fever with it, and by February, the fever had everything. Eleanor lasted 5 weeks after Thomas. This surprised no one who had known them well. They had been the kind of married people who seemed to operate as a single mechanism, not in the soft romantic way that people sometimes describe such marriages, but in the practical load-bearing way of 2 timbers set against each other in a wall. When one went, the structure changed. Eleanor did not give up. She simply declined steadily and without drama, the way a fire declines when the wood runs low, giving heat until it no longer could. Clara was 14 years old and the last Voss on 40 acres of the best farmland in the northern part of Granger County, and for 7 months she had managed it alone. She had put in the spring garden. She had kept the chickens. She had patched the barn roof with boards she pulled from the old tobacco shed, hauling them on her back because there was no one else to haul them. She had traded eggs for flour at the Sutton store, and she had made do, and she had told herself that making do was enough, that the land was still the land, that something would resolve. What resolved was Sheriff Dale Mercer's tax claim filed 48 hours after Thomas Voss's burial. Clara had not known about the claim for months. The county did not advertise such things to the person being claimed against, and the neighbors who knew. And several of them knew because Granger County was not a large place, and information traveled through it the way water travels through limestone. Finding every crack, the neighbors who knew had said nothing either, from the particular cowardice of people who tell themselves that silence is neutrality, or from the practical fear of a man who controlled the credit at 3 of the 4 commercial establishments in town. She had found out in August from a lawyer in Knoxville who had heard about the claim through his firm's correspondence with the county recorder. He had written her a letter that was kind in its opening sentences and less kind in its specifics. The letter explained that the taxes assessed against the Voss property had been calculated using a valuation method that differed from the one applied to comparable properties in the county, a valuation that curiously resulted in a significantly higher tax obligation than her father's records showed he had paid in previous years. The lawyer's letter did not use the word fraud. Lawyers rarely did in letters that might later be read by judges, but it used enough careful language around enough specific facts that Clara, who had taught herself to read carefully at an early age, understood what the letter was actually saying. She had written back asking what could be done. The lawyer had replied that the legal fees to contest the claim would exceed the assessed value of the property, and that without a family member of legal age to appear in court and without funds to retain representation, the county's claim would proceed to judgment. He had expressed his regrets in the last paragraph. The letter cost him a stamp and half an hour of a clerk's time and had the careful practiced warmth of a condolence note written for someone the writer did not actually know. She went back inside after the sheriff's men left and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The kitchen still smelled like her mother wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint sweetness of the lard Eleanor kept in a crock on the shelf. And Clara sat with that smell and let herself have 10 minutes of something she did not have a precise name for. Not grief exactly, because grief had been going on for months and she was not finished with it, but she had learned to carry it alongside other things. It was closer to the feeling of a door closing, the small, definitive sound of a latch catching. Then she got up and began to pack. She was disciplined about it. She had been thinking in a distant, contingent way about what she would take if she ever had to leave, the way people who live near rivers think sometimes about what they would grab if the water rose. She took one change of clothes, her father's canvas rucksack, her mother's Bible with Eleanor's handwriting in the margins, small notes made during Sunday readings, practical observations about faith applied to daily life, the marginalia of a woman who treated Scripture the way she treated everything, as a source of usable information. She took the knife with the bone handle that had belonged to her grandfather, a man she had never met, but whose name she shared in the middle. She took a pouch of dried pinto beans from the pantry shelf. The books were the hardest choice because she wanted all of them, and she could carry 3. She took the Farmer's Bulletin number 616, published by the United States Department of Agriculture, which she had read so many times that the spine had cracked in 2 places, and she had repaired it with strips of flour paste and brown paper. She took the almanac from 1929, which was outdated but contained tables and charts about weather patterns, soil temperatures, and planting cycles that remained accurate regardless of the year on the cover. And she took the slim green volume that her teacher, Miss Agnes Abernathy, had given her the previous spring, Principles of Soil and Plant Growth, a university press edition, with diagrams that Clara had traced in pencil on the flyleaves until she had memorized the shapes. Miss Abernathy had pressed the book into Clara's hands on the last day of the school term with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone performing an act they have thought about for some time. "You have a mind like good soil, Clara. Everything you put into it grows." She had said it without sentiment, as a statement of observed fact, and then walked back to the board to write the next day's assignment. Clara had stood holding the book and felt something clarify in her chest, not pride exactly, but recognition, the feeling of being accurately seen by someone whose opinion was worth having. She left the house at noon. The road north ran along the fence line of the Hargrove property for half a mile before it bent toward the creek and then straightened again toward the foothills. Clara walked it in her good boots, which were also her only boots, and she did not permit herself to look back at the house or the barn or the row of dogwood trees standing their careful distance apart along the front path. She fixed her eyes on the road ahead, and she walked. Mrs. Sutton came out of her house as Clara passed. She stood on the porch with a dish towel in her hands and her face arranged into an expression of genuine sorrow that was also entirely useless. And she said she was sorry, truly sorry, and that she wished there was something she could do. She had brought a basket of biscuits earlier that morning before the sheriff's men came and left it on the Voss porch without knocking, which was the gesture of a woman who wanted to help without having to witness the thing she was helping with. Clara thanked her for the biscuits. She did not stop walking. The day was cold and clear, the kind of October clarity that comes in Tennessee when the heat finally releases its claim on the air, and everything sharpens the line of the ridge against the sky, the color of the oaks gone to orange and rust, the sound of the creek carrying farther than it would in summer. Clara walked. She thought about water. She thought about the water table beneath the Voss property, which her father had described once as a gift. The land had been born with a natural spring that fed a creek that never ran dry. Not in the drought of 1930, not in the dry summer of 1931. She thought about the county assessor deciding that water table was worth more than the law allowed the county to claim at the standard rate, and she thought about Mercer's office filing the inflated assessment 48 hours after her father's burial, and she let herself feel the full shape of that anger for about 3 minutes as she walked. Then she put it somewhere interior and kept moving. She slept the first night under a limestone overhang above Painter Creek, wrapped in her shawl with her rucksack against her back for insulation, listening to coyotes calling across the ridge in the dark. The sound was not frightening to her. She had grown up hearing it. What was strange was the absence of the sound she was used to, the particular creak of the Voss house settling in the cold, the way the barn door shifted in the wind, the small domestic sound of the fire dying in the stove. The overhang was silent except for the creek and the coyotes and her own breathing, and the silence had a texture she hadn't expected. She ate 3 biscuits from Mrs. Sutton's basket and drank from the creek and did not allow herself to think past the next day. The second day she climbed. The road gave out after 4 miles and became a game trail, and the game trail grew steeper as the oaks gave way to hickory and then to the white pines that covered the upper slopes of Buckhorn Mountain. Her legs ached by mid-morning and ached worse by afternoon, but the ache was preferable to thinking, and so she used it that way, kept her attention in her body and the burn across her shoulders from the rucksack and the tight protest of her calves on the grade, and let the thinking wait. By mid-afternoon, she could see the valley below her through breaks in the trees spread out like something a schoolbook would use to illustrate the word panorama. The patchwork of brown fields, the silver thread of Archer Creek, the cluster of buildings that was the town of Granger, with its water tower and its courthouse steeple. She could see, she thought, the roof line of the Voss house from this distance. She was not certain. She did not look long. The trail wound between limestone outcroppings that grew larger as she climbed, gray and massive, streaked with the mineral staining of centuries of water moving through rock. She had read about karst limestone formations in the plant growth book, Miss Abernathy's book, in a chapter about the relationship between bedrock geology and soil composition. Karst limestone dissolves slowly under slightly acidic rainwater, creating underground channels and cavities, producing soils that were often mineral-rich in specific ways that affected what would grow in them. She had found the chapter interesting in an abstract way, the kind of information that sat quietly in the back of her mind, cataloged under useful someday, and she had not thought about it again until she was standing among outcroppings of exactly the rock described and thinking, as she always eventually thought, about what would grow and where. It was late afternoon when the warmth touched her face. She was moving along the base of a tall limestone face, following the game trail, around a curve when she felt a draft of air against her left cheek that was several degrees warmer than the surrounding air. She stopped. The trail went forward. The warmth came from her left, from what appeared to be a wall of dead vegetation, sumac gone brown and woody, with the season a curtain of Virginia creeper hanging dry and rustling against the rock face. She stood and felt the warmth for a moment and then turned to face it. The opening was narrow, not much wider than her shoulders, hidden entirely by the dead sumac and the creeper, invisible from the trail at any distance greater than 2 feet, which explained why she had almost passed it. She pushed through the dry brush, the branches scratching her arms and catching at her rucksack, and stepped into darkness. The passage was tight and low and ran back into the rock for what felt like 9 or 10 steps, and then it opened. She heard it before she saw it, the change in the acoustics, The way her footsteps suddenly had space around them instead of stone, the particular quality of echo that belongs to large chambers. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw. The chamber was enormous. The ceiling arched above her in the darkness. She could not see the top of it clearly, but the scale was like standing inside the nave of a church, the kind of scale that makes the body feel its actual size. The walls curved around her pale limestone, catching the last of the afternoon light that came through, and this was the thing that made her breath stop. 4 natural openings in the south-facing wall. Not windows, not cut by any human hand. Erosion gaps in the limestone face, irregular in shape, the largest perhaps 4 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Through them, the late October light fell into the chamber in distinct shafts, 4 columns of pale gold crossing the cave floor at an angle that told her exactly where the sun was in the sky and what direction the openings faced. South. The openings faced south. She stood at the edge of that light for a long time without moving. The cave floor beneath her was covered in a deep layer of fine sediment. Not sand exactly, more like silt, the color of river clay, the texture of something that had been deposited slowly over a very long time. She crouched and took a handful and rubbed it between her palms. It was damp with the cave's humidity, but not wet. Fine-grained, heavy. She pressed it and it held its shape. She brought it close to her face in the available light and tried to read its color, gray-blue, slightly richer, in the places where the light columns fell, the color of the soil she had read about in the chapter on alluvial deposits. The kind of soil that built up at the bottoms of things, at river bends, at the base of slopes, over hundreds of years of water carrying mineral particles and setting them down. She stood up and turned around, slowly making a full circle in the center of the chamber. The temperature. She had been warm since she crossed the threshold, warmer than she had been all day on the trail in the October air. And she stood now and tried to estimate the temperature in the way her father had taught her. Hold your arm out, feel the air against your skin, compare it to what you know. The cave was significantly warmer than outside, 12 or 13 degrees Celsius, she estimated. Not warm by living standards, but warm in the way that mattered, which was consistently so, not subject to wind, not losing heat at night, the way open ground did, held by the thermal mass of hundreds of feet of solid limestone above and around it. There was water. A stream ran along the far wall, clear and narrow, moving over smooth stones with the soft insistence of water that has found its channel and intends to use it. It disappeared into a crack in the eastern wall. She walked to it and cupped her hand and drank. Cold, clean, the faint mineral taste of limestone. She went back to the center of the chamber. She stood in one of the light columns and looked up through the opening above her at the strip of sky visible from inside the mountain, pale blue, late afternoon, a single cloud moving through it from west to east. She calculated 6 hours of direct light in the chamber on the shortest days of winter, based on the angle of the openings in the sun's winter arc across the southern sky. Possibly more in the weeks around the solstice, if the angle worked in her favor. The sediment floor, the constant temperature, the water. She took the almanac from her rucksack. She opened it to the back pages where there were still several blank leaves. She had saved them deliberately in the way of a person who understands that blank paper is a resource. She took the stub of pencil from her shirt pocket. She wrote temperature approximately 12 to 13 degrees Celsius, light 6 hours minimum, water present and constant, floor sediment deep, fine, mineral rich. Winter wheat germinates at 10 degrees, 6 hours sufficient for slow growth. Growing season inside cave indefinite. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote below it, "It can be done." She said it aloud as well, because she had read once that saying a thing aloud was different from thinking it, that speaking used different parts of the mind and committed to the conclusion in a different way. The words sounded strange in the cave, absorbed by the stone and the silt and the dark. She said it again. Then she began to measure the floor, in paces, walking careful measured steps from wall to wall, and counting, writing the numbers in the almanac, sketching the rough dimensions of the chamber from memory. She had found a cave. She had not yet found a way to grow anything in it. The distance between those two things was the problem. She spent the rest of that evening thinking about, sitting with her back against the west wall in the warm, dark eating beans she had soaked in her tin cup and drinking from the stream, while outside the mountain the October dark came down over the valley and the last of the light faded from the openings above. There was the matter of seeds. She had none. She had dried beans for eating and nothing for planting. There was the matter of knowledge. She knew the theory of what she was proposing, had read enough agricultural science to understand the conditions required, but theory and practice were separated by the kind of distance that usually requires a teacher to cross. And there was the matter of the soil itself. The sediment was promising, but she could not know its mineral content by looking at it, could not know whether it lacked something essential, whether it would hold root systems, whether the cave's humidity and the water table beneath her feet would turn it waterlogged and sour in winter. She fell asleep thinking about nitrogen. She woke before first light to the sound of the stream, and in the moment between sleep and full wakefulness, the moment when the mind is still loose enough to make unusual connections, she thought about Edmund Hale. She had heard his name twice. Once from her father, who had mentioned a man living on the north face of Buckhorn Mountain, a former engineer of some kind, retired to the hills, odd but knowledgeable, the sort of man who knew things from a life spent in practical work that you could not get from books. And once from Miss Abernathy, who had told her class that the most valuable people in any community were often the ones the community had decided were too strange to talk to, because strangeness in intelligent people frequently meant they had arrived somewhere the rest of the community had not yet gone. Clara did not know which part of the north face his cabin was on. She spent the morning exploring the cave, more carefully mapping the second chamber she found through a low passage to the north. Smaller, darker, the temperature a degree or two warmer due to its distance from the entrance. The floor, the same fine sediment. She cataloged what she saw. She noted that the smaller chamber had no direct light, but received ambient light reflected off the main chamber walls during peak hours. She thought about what would grow without direct light. Root vegetables, possibly mushrooms. She wrote it in the almanac. Then she went to find Edmund Hale. She spent the better part of 3 hours on the north-facing slope before she found the cabin, a small structure of squared timber and stone, settled into the hillside with the permanence of something that had been there long enough to start belonging to the landscape. Smoke from the chimney. A chopping block with an axe standing in it. A kitchen garden, long since harvested, and turned under the black soil in neat rows that told her immediately that whoever tended this garden was methodical. She was still assessing the garden when the door opened. Edmund Hale was 73 years old and had the build of a man who had spent decades moving through confined spaces, compact, careful, his shoulders slightly curved in the habitual posture of someone accustomed to low ceilings. His face was deeply lined in a way that was not merely age, but weather and attention, the lines of a man who had spent 40 years looking at rock faces and reading them the way other men read text. He stood in the doorway and looked at Clara the way she had looked at the cave sediment, assessing without judgment, but thoroughly. She expected him to ask who she was. He did not. He looked at the rucksack, at her boots, at the state of her coat, and he said she looked like she could eat something, and he stood aside from the door. She sat at his table and he put cornbread and a bowl of something that smelled like venison in front of her without ceremony, and she ate while he sat across from her and said nothing. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of a man who had lived alone long enough to understand that conversation did not need to fill every moment, who was comfortable with the presence of another person without requiring their words. When she finished eating, she told him who she was. She told him about the Voss land and the tax seizure and Mercer's claim and the eviction notice plainly, without self-pity, moving through it the way she moved through a difficult passage in a book, carefully, not skipping, not letting the hard parts rush her. He listened. His expression did not change in the way of a person who is disturbed by what they hear. It changed in the way of a person who is adding information to a calculation already in progress. When she finished, he said, "I know about the Mercer family, 3 generations of men who've treated this county like a personal account." He said it without heat, as though it were a geological fact. She told him about the cave. She told him about the temperature and the light and the water and the sediment, and she told him what she believed it would be possible to grow there and why. She was precise. She used the correct terms from the bulletin and the plant growth book. She did not soften the parts that were speculative or claim certainty she didn't have. When she finished, she said, "I need seeds, winter wheat primarily, and I need someone who understands soil drainage to tell me whether what I'm proposing is structurally possible or whether I'm missing something." Edmund Hale leaned back in his chair. He did not immediately respond. He looked at a point on the wall behind her with the expression of a man running a calculation, and the calculation appeared to take some time. Then he said, "If you've come here expecting me to tell you it's a fine idea and hand you a sack of wheat seed, you've got the wrong idea of what I am." Clara said she understood that. "I spent 40 years in mines and tunnels and natural cave systems doing geological survey work. I've seen a great many underground spaces. Most of the ideas people have about growing things in them are wrong." He paused. "The ones that are right are very right. The difference is in the details." She took the almanac from her rucksack. She opened it to the pages where she had sketched the cave dimensions and the position of the light openings and her estimate of the temperature. She had also that morning drawn a rough diagram of the light columns at different times of day based on her observation of where they fell on the cave floor and the angle of their movement across it. She set the almanac on the table between them and turned it so he could read it. Edmund Hale looked at the diagrams for a long time. He picked up the almanac carefully as a man handles something that is not his and tipped it toward the light from the window. He studied the rendering of the cave floor dimensions. He traced the light column angles with one finger without touching the paper. He read what she had written in the margins. He set it back down. "These light angles," he said, "did you observe them directly or estimate them?" She told him she had marked the cave floor with small stones where the light columns fell at noon and again 2 hours later, then sketched the positions and the angle of movement. He was quiet for another moment. "Then karst limestone on this section of Buckhorn has a particular quality. The south-facing walls above the cave line, assuming this is the cave system I'm thinking of, which I believe it is based on the elevation you're describing, those walls contain significant veins of mica schist. Reflective. The light entering through those erosion gaps would bounce off the mica before it entered the chamber, possibly adding an hour or more of effective light you haven't calculated." He paused. "It would make the growing conditions better than you think they are, not worse." Clara looked at him. She had not written that down yet. "I didn't know about the mica. Most people don't know about it because most people haven't looked at the mineralogy of this section of the ridgeline." He stood up from the table with the deliberateness of a man whose joints required negotiation and walked to the window. Outside, the north slope of Buckhorn dropped away through the pines to the valley. He stood looking at it. "The other problem," he said, "is drainage. You cannot grow anything in flat sediment that receives constant seepage from an underground water table. The roots sit in water and rot. The plants die in 2 weeks." She said she knew about the drainage problem. She had been thinking about terracing. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the expression that had been building since she put the almanac on the table, the expression of a man who has been told something that has moved him involuntarily from one position to another. "Terracing," he said. She told him what she had been thinking, 6 terraces stepping down from the south wall toward the stream, each level graded slightly away from the uphill wall to channel water toward a narrow runoff groove, the water running from terrace to terrace by gravity before draining back into the stream. She described the dimensions she had estimated based on the available floor space and the materials she would need. She said she did not know how to build them correctly, and that was what she needed from him. Edmund Hale looked at her for a long time. He was 73 years old, and his knees had been a source of ongoing negotiation for 6 years, and he had not climbed to the upper section of Buckhorn's south face in at least 4. He had lived alone for 30 years by preference, and solitude had become the texture of his life rather than merely a condition of it. "If I go up to this cave of yours," he said, "and the geology is what you say, it is not what you think it is, what you say it is specifically, I'll help you design the terracing. I'll give you seeds. I have winter wheat and rye both." He held up one finger. "But I want to see it first. Because if you've misread the drainage or the light or the temperature, you will spend the winter trying to grow things that will die, and that's a harder way to learn than hearing me tell you now." She said that was fair. He said they would go the next morning. She slept that night in the loft of his woodshed in a space between stacked cordwood that was warm from the residual heat of the logs. She lay in the dark and thought about the terraces. She thought about what Edmund had said about the mica and the reflective quality of the walls. She thought about the angle of winter light and whether 6 hours was truly sufficient for winter wheat to develop at the growth rate described in the bulletin, or whether the bulletin's figures assumed open field conditions that the cave would not precisely replicate. She lay in the warmth of someone else's stored work, the labor of cutting and splitting and stacking all those cords of wood now radiating heat around her, and she felt for the first time in months something that was not fear or grief or the forward-tilted urgency of solving the next problem. She felt a provisional, conditional thing that she would not yet call hope, because hope seemed too large and uncertain a word for it. She would call it instead a working hypothesis. She had a working hypothesis. She would test it in the morning. Edmund was ready before she came down from the loft. He had his coat on and his walking stick and a canvas bag over one shoulder. He walked ahead of her up the trail for the first quarter mile, setting his pace with the walking stick, and she let him lead because he knew the mountain better than she did. When the trail grew steep, he slowed but did not stop. He did not ask for help, and she did not offer it. When they reached the south face and she pushed through the sumac curtain and led him through the passage and into the chamber, she stepped aside and let him see it for himself. Edmund Hale stood in the entrance of the main chamber and looked at it. He looked for a long time, which she had expected. She watched him look at the ceiling and the light columns and the stream and the floor, and she watched his engineer's attention move systematically over the space the way it had moved over her almanac sketches piece by piece, assessing each element separately before connecting them. He walked to the south wall. He ran his hand along the limestone surface and found, without appearing to look for it, one of the mica veins she hadn't known about, a seam of slightly different mineral running through the gray of the cave wall, pale and fractionally reflective, even in the cave's ambient light. He crouched slowly with effort and took a handful of the silt floor. He did what she had done, rubbed it between his palms, held it close to examine the color, pressed it. He let it fall and rubbed his palms together to clean them. He walked to the stream and stood listening to it. Then he walked back to the center of the chamber and stood in one of the light columns and looked up through the opening at the sky. He said, "The light is better than your diagram showed. The mica content in that south wall doubles the effective luminosity in the chamber during peak hours. I'd estimate 7 to 8 hours of useful growing light in December, not 6. He paused. "The drainage situation is exactly as bad as I said. The water table under this silt is within 8 inches of the surface in the western section. Anything planted flat there will rot within a month." She waited. "But the eastern section," he pointed, "slightly higher elevation within the chamber. The table drops to maybe 14 inches down in that portion. Still too high for flat planting, but with terracing that moves the growing surface up another 8 inches above grade, you'd have sufficient separation." He turned and looked at her. "You'll need 6 terraces stepped. The grade I would use is 5 degrees from horizontal, enough to move water, but not enough to cause erosion of the silt. Stone borders for each terrace, local limestone from the walls where it's shed. Naturally, you'll find plenty of it against the base of the east wall. Your irrigation channels between levels are sound in concept, but the width needs to be narrower than you'd think, 3 inches maximum, or the flow rate will move the silt too quickly and you'll lose your growing medium." He looked around the chamber once more. He took off his hat, not in the manner of someone performing a gesture, but in the automatic, unconscious way of a man who has entered a space that has earned that response. Then he put it back on. "The second chamber through the north passage," he said. "Did you look at it?" She said she had. "Root vegetables. The temperature is stable, and the light from the main chamber, even reflected, will be enough for species that don't require direct exposure. Beets, carrots, turnips." He paused. "And mushrooms. You'll want to look for bat activity in the side passages. Guano is as good a nitrogen source as you'll find up here." She had her almanac open. She was writing. He gave her the seeds that afternoon at his cabin, winter wheat and rye, from labeled cans on his pantry shelf, in a small cloth pouch of turnip seeds. He said he'd been saving since the summer. He also gave her the short-handled hoe and the hand trowel and a pick for breaking up the harder sections of the cave floor near the stream wall. He told her to come back if she ran into a drainage problem she couldn't diagnose, and to come back in any case after the first planting, because he intended to see whether the terrace design functioned as calculated. She thanked him. He said she should save her thanks for something that had actually worked. She went back up the mountain in that evening with the seeds in her rucksack and the tools over her shoulder and the almanac full of new notes. She went into the cave and sat in the dark at the center of the main chamber, while the last of the light faded from the openings above her, and she thought about what came next. The terraces would take 2 weeks to build properly. She would need to work systematically starting from the eastern section, where the water table was lowest, moving westward only as far as the drainage calculation justified. She would need to source enough flat limestone from the wall base to border 6 levels. She would need to mix the bat guano with the silt in the leaf litter she could bring in from outside and let it condition for at least a week before planting. The January planting window for winter wheat in this elevation, she had the table in the bulletin adjusted for the cave's temperature differential, was approximately 3 weeks. If she missed it, she would wait until the following autumn, which was not a thing she could afford. She had enough dried beans for perhaps 6 weeks. The persimmons and black walnuts on the slope would carry her past that, if she was careful, and the creek outside held enough water still in its pools to sustain a small fire and cooking. But 6 weeks was the length of rope she was working with, and she could not waste any of it. She laid out the rucksack and arranged the seed pouches in order of priority and the tools by frequency of expected use. She refilled her tin cup from the stream. She ate a careful portion of the beans she had soaked through the afternoon, and she sat with her back against the cave wall in the consistent temperature of the mountain's interior, and she let the enormity of what she was proposing sit with her for exactly as long as it needed to, which was not very long. She had a cave, she had seeds, she had the knowledge of a man who had spent 40 years learning how underground spaces behaved. She had 3 books and a pencil. She had the working hypothesis. Outside, the Tennessee autumn was ending. The oaks were losing their leaves and the cold was coming down from the ridge the way it always did, and the valley below was entering the long brown season of waiting. In 40 acres of land, she no longer owned the dogwood trees her mother had planted, were losing the last of their leaves in the dark, standing in their careful spacing along the front path, tended by no one. Inside the mountain, the temperature held at 12 degrees Celsius, and the stream ran clear over its smooth stones, and the silt floor lay undisturbed and full of possibility, and Clara Voss opened her almanac to a clean page and began to plan. The terraces took 18 days. Clara worked from first light to the point each afternoon when the light columns shifted off the eastern floor and the chamber dimmed enough that she could no longer see the grade of what she was building. She broke the harder sections of cave floor near the stream wall with the pick, and the sound of iron striking limestone rang through the chamber and came back to her. Changed, flattened, absorbed the cave, consuming the noise of her work the way it consumed everything quietly and without comment. She moved silt in her father's canvas rucksack load after load from the western section, where the water table ran too close to the surface, to the eastern terraces, where it did not. She collected flat limestone pieces from the base of the east wall, where centuries of freeze-thaw cycling had shed them from the face in naturally useful shapes, and she set them as borders for each level with the care of someone who understands that a wall built wrong the first time will need to be built again. Edmund came on the 4th day and the 9th day. On the 4th day, he walked the terrace outlines she had scratched into the silt and adjusted the grade of the 3rd terrace by tilting 2 of the border stones a fraction of an inch, explaining in his engineer's shorthand that the grade needed to move water, not pool it, and that the difference between those 2 outcomes was sometimes a matter of a single degree. On the 9th day, he looked at the irrigation channel she had cut between the levels 3 inches wide, as he had specified, running from the lip of each terrace to the top of the next, and he said they were correct. He did not make it a compliment. He said it the way you confirm a measurement as information. She mixed the growing medium over 3 days, the cave silt as base leaf litter she carried in from the slope outside, in armloads that filled the cave with the smell of the forest and bat guano. She scraped from the dome ceiling of the side passage, where a colony had established itself behind a limestone curtain. The guano was dark and concentrated, and it smelled like something elemental, like the earth digesting itself, and she mixed it into the silt at the ratio Edmund had described from memory. 1 part guano to 8 parts. Base medium, worked in thoroughly with the short hoe until the color of the mixture deepened to a rich gray-brown that held its shape when pressed and released it when pressed harder. She let it condition for 8 days before she touched a seed. The 1st of January, 1935, arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew the date because she had been marking days on the almanac's inside back covers since her second night in the cave, a single small line for each morning. She woke up and the mountain was still around her, and she was still inside it. She planted the wheat on that Tuesday, pressing each seed into the conditioned silt with her thumb, spacing them 2 inches apart in the careful rows she had laid out with a length of twine stretched between small stakes of green wood. 600 seeds on the first terrace alone. The work took most of the day, conducted in the silence of the cave, with the light columns moving slowly across the floor beside her and the stream murmuring its steady commentary from the far wall. And when she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. 6 terraces of dark-turned earth, seated and waiting, holding the quiet potential of 600 small decisions. The waiting that followed was the hardest thing she had done, which surprised her because she had expected the physical labor to be hardest. But labor had occupied her mind, as well as her body had given her thoughts somewhere useful to go, had made every day a series of specific problems to solve in sequence. Waiting gave her thoughts nowhere to go but inward and inward. In January alone, inside a mountain with dwindling provisions and the cold outside pressing against the rock, like something with intention, was not a safe direction. She managed it by studying. She reread the bulletin from the first page slowly enough to catch details she had skimmed in earlier readings, making notes in the almanac margins about anything applicable to her situation. She made a more precise map of both cave chambers, measuring with her stride and the length of her arm, noting the variation in ceiling height and floor temperature across different sections of the space. She found on the 14th day of waiting that she could read the cave's humidity by the feel of the air against the back of her hand, a slight coolness that came not from temperature change, but from increased moisture, which she learned to associate with rain outside the water table rising fractionally in response to precipitation on the mountain above. She logged these observations the way a weather station logs readings in columns daily, because the act of recording made the observations into knowledge rather than mere experience. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. The persimmons from the slope outside were gone by mid-December, and the black walnuts she had cached near the cave entrance had dwindled to the last of them by the end of the month. She was living on thin bean soup made with creek water and the careful rationing of the dried pinto beans that had seemed adequate in October and now seemed in the contracted arithmetic of hunger to shrink faster than days passed. Her ribs became distinct beneath her fingers when she pressed her side. Her coat, which had fitted well in October, now shifted loosely on her shoulders. There were mornings when she stood up too quickly and the chamber tilted around her in a way that had nothing to do with the cave and everything to do with what she was not eating. She did not write about this in the almanac. She wrote about soil temperature and light column angles and the moisture content of the growing medium. The hunger was not information. It was just the condition under which the work was being done, and cataloging it would not change it. On the 19th day, she found the first shoot. She had been checking the first terrace every morning since planting, pressing 2 fingers gently into the silt between the seed rows, feeling for the slight change in soil structure that preceded germination, a softening in the medium around the seed as it absorbed moisture and began to swell. She had felt the change 3 days earlier and had made herself stop checking twice a day because the checking itself began to feel like a kind of superstition, a bargaining with the ground. On the 19th morning, she pressed her fingers into the silt at the midpoint of the first row and felt something different, a slight resistance, a texture change, something happening at the surface that was not just silt. She pulled her hand back and looked. It was barely visible. A thread of pale green emerging from the dark soil, no thicker than a heavy piece of sewing thread, bent slightly at the tip in the shape that seedlings make when they are pushing against the surface resistance of the ground for the first time. In the cave's ambient light, it was almost the same color as the silt. She had to move so that one of the light columns fell across that section of the terrace before she could be certain she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. She sat down on the cave floor. The cold of the stone came through her clothing immediately, and she sat in it and looked at the chute and did not move for a period of time she could not have estimated accurately afterward. Later, she would think of it as the moment the hypothesis became the fact, the moment when everything she had calculated and planned and carried up the mountain and worked into the earth completed its transformation from intention into life, a thread of green in a dark place. It was so small that the word small failed to describe it. It was also the most significant thing she had ever seen, and she understood that this was not an exaggeration, that some things are both tiny and enormous simultaneously. and that the inability to hold those two qualities together is a failure of the imagination rather than a contradiction in the thing itself. She was crying. She noticed this as a secondary fact, the way you notice peripheral information when the center of attention is consuming most of your resources. Her face was wet and her chest was doing something complicated, and she sat on the cold floor of the cave inside a mountain in the dead of a Tennessee January, and she cried for the first time since she had walked away from the house in October without looking back. She cried for about 4 minutes. Then she stopped, wiped her face with the back of her hand, took the almanac out of her coat pocket, and wrote January 19th, 1935. First germination confirmed, row 3, terrace 1. Shoot approximately 2 millimeters. Growing medium performing as calculated. Temperature, nominal. She set the almanac down and looked at the shoot again for a moment. Then she got up and began checking the rest of the rows. By the end of that day, she had found 11 shoots on the first terrace and 4 on the second. By the end of the week, there were more than she could count without disturbing the rows. The first terrace had become a field in miniature, a dense grid of pale green threads that by the third week of February had grown to finger height, and by March had become something that could only be described honestly as a carpet, a continuous surface of wheat growing in the belly of a mountain by the filtered light of 4 gaps in a limestone wall, fed by the slow gravity flow of an underground stream running down through channels she had cut with a 3-inch hoe. Edmund came in March and stood at the entrance to the main chamber. He stood there for a full minute, and she watched him look at it, the way she had watched him look at everything systematically, piece by piece, the engineer's assessment, moving from the terraces to the irrigation channels to the color of the wheat itself, which was slightly paler than field wheat it would be at this stage, but growing demonstrably and undeniably growing. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he took off his hat and held it at his side. "I've built mines in 4 states and surveyed cave systems in 6. His voice carrying the particular quality of a man confronting a gap between what he expected and what he found. And I have never seen anything like this. She began work on the second chamber in April, clearing the floor for root vegetables and moving growing medium through the low passage in the rucksack. Load after load, the way she had moved everything, one carrying weight at a time, accumulating toward the goal. The turnips Edmund had given her went into the second chamber's prepared rows in early April, along with carrot seeds she had traded for a half-day's work, helping a woman named Mrs. Fowler, who lived 3 miles down the north slope and asked no questions, carry winter stores from her root cellar to the house. Clara worked the second chamber's floor at a higher grade than the main terraces, because the absence of direct light meant the growing medium would retain more moisture, and drainage was correspondingly more important. She also began in April the work of light extension. She spent 3 afternoons collecting pieces of mica-bearing limestone from the sections of wall where natural erosion had shed them, and she positioned these along the terrace edges and against the wall base. At angles she calculated by eye and adjusted by observation. The effect was subtle but measurable. The light reaching the outer sections of the terraces brightened noticeably. She was not creating light. She was redirecting what was already there, sharing it further into the space, which was a different thing, and in some ways a more satisfying one. She harvested the first wheat in May. 40 pounds from 6 terraces ground by hand between 2 flat stones she had selected from the stream bed for their particular smoothness and density. The grinding took 2 days and produced a flour that was coarser than what came from a mill, but was in every nutritional sense that mattered the thing it claimed to be. She built a small fire at the cave entrance, outside where the smoke could clear, and baked the first loaf in a tin she had traded Mrs. Fowler for using creek water, and a small amount of the salt she had been rationing since November. She brought the loaf to Edmund the next morning. He was sitting on his porch in the early warmth of a May morning, with a book open in his lap, and he looked at the loaf, and then at her, and then at the loaf again. He cut a slice with a pocket knife, and ate it slowly with the attention of a man who has learned over 7 decades that some things deserve more attention than they typically receive. "It tastes like bread," the words arriving without inflection as a straight report. She told him that was the point. He looked at the remaining loaf for a moment and then cut another slice, and she understood this was the only form of endorsement he was going to offer, and that it was sufficient. It was Mercer's hired man who saw her. She had not known that Edmund had a visitor on that afternoon in late May, a man from the valley who came twice a year to buy trapping supplies, and whose name Edmund had mentioned once without attaching much importance to it. He came around the side of the cabin as Clara was leaving, and he stopped and looked at her with the particular alertness of a man who is remembering something. She had not been in Granger County for 7 months, and she was noticeably thinner than she had been in October. But she was still recognizably herself, and the name Voss was not a common one in this part of Tennessee. She was back in the cave before dark. Edmund sent word through Mrs. Fowler. 4 days later, 2 men from the valley had been asking about a young woman living on the mountain. The men had described her accurately. They had asked which trails she used and whether she came down regularly and who she spoke to. She sat with this information for an afternoon and understood what it meant with the same precision she brought to understanding anything else. Mercer could not afford the existence of a Voss girl who had survived his eviction and built something on a public mountain. Not because she was a legal threat, she had no money and no lawyer, but because survival itself was a form of testimony. A girl who had been thrown off her family's land and had not disappeared, who had instead remained and made something, and was now apparently exchanging goods with people in the surrounding community, was a story. And stories in a county where Mercer's authority rested partly on the impression that opposition was futile were dangerous. She did not panic. Panic was she had found a state that consumed resources without producing an information, and she had limited resources and required information. She spent the next 3 days harvesting everything ready to harvest the turnip greens from the second chamber, the early yield from the first wheat terrace's outer rows, the first of the small mushrooms she had been cultivating on rotting log sections dragged in from the slope. She moved everything to the deepest section of the second chamber. She reinforced the sumac curtain over the cave entrance with additional brush woven into the existing growth until the opening was invisible even to someone standing 3 feet away. She established 2 alternate routes from the cave to Edmund's cabin, both of which avoided the main game trail. She stayed inside for 22 days. She did not come out except before dawn and after full dark, and then only to gather water from the creek, and on 2 occasions to check on Edmund, moving through the pine forest without a light, and trusting what she had learned over 9 months about the particular character of the mountain's terrain at night. Mercer's men came on the 8th day. She heard them from inside the cave, 2 voices on the main trail moving slowly stopping. One of them apparently pushed through the brush along the cliff base for a short distance. She heard the sumac branches catching at clothing, heard a voice saying there was nothing there, heard footsteps retreating. She sat in the darkness of the second chamber with her hand on the bone-handled knife and her breathing quiet and even, and she waited until she could no longer hear anything but the stream. They did not come back. The summer of 1935 was a teaching summer, though she had not planned it that way. Mrs. Fowler had a sister-in-law named Ruth whose husband had died that spring and who was trying to maintain a garden plot too large for one person and not large enough for the children to eat from reliably. Ruth came to ask Clara if she had seeds to spare. Clara had seeds. She had been careful from the first harvest to set aside a portion of the best-formed wheat for the following season's planting, allowing nothing with irregular development into the seed stock. She gave Ruth a portion of wheat seed and carrot seed and spent a morning explaining the principles of soil preparation and the importance of planting depth and watering consistency. Ruth came back in August with her oldest son, 16 years old and serious-faced, who had questions of his own. Clara answered them. The boy came back twice more before the summer ended, each time with more specific questions about soil composition and drainage questions that told her he had been thinking carefully in the weeks between visits. She gave him a copy of the relevant pages from the bulletin, which she had transcribed by hand into a section of the almanac specifically for the purpose of sharing. The knowledge moved outward from there in the way that useful knowledge moves through isolated communities, not through announcement, but through the particular efficiency of people who need something and tell the specific other people who might have it. By late summer, 2 other families had found their way up the north slope to ask about cave growing, and Clara discovered that she had become, without intending it, a teacher. She was not uncomfortable with this. Teaching required her to explain what she knew clearly, and the requirement for clarity improved her own understanding of what she was doing and why, the same way that writing a thing down makes the thing more precise. Edmund's health shifted in the fall of 1935. She noticed it first in the way he moved the walking stick, used more consistently, the pauses on the cabin porch that stretched longer than his habit of stillness explained. His mind was unchanged. His knowledge of anything became more concentrated as his body required more of his attention, as though the energy that had gone into movement redirected itself toward thinking. He called her down to the cabin in November and spent 3 weeks teaching her things she had not known to ask about. He taught her to read the seismic character of the cave walls, which sections were stable under the mountain's seasonal pressure and which showed the hairline patterning that indicated stress, and why it mattered for where and how she built within the chambers. He taught her to calculate the load-bearing capacity of the terrace borders based on the dimensions of the stones and their placement so that she could extend the system without risking collapse. He drew in precise detail on paper she had brought from the cave's growing store, the expanded version of the terrace system that could accommodate 20 growing levels if the cave floor was prepared correctly. He taught her how to read the underground stream's behavior through the seasons, by the sound it made against its stones, a knowledge that was not in any book because it could only be learned by ear over time. And he was giving her the compressed version, the meaning of variations she would later teach herself to hear directly. He also told her about the mushrooms. She had been growing shiitake and oyster varieties on rotting cottonwood logs she dragged in from the slope in the darkest section of the second chamber where the humidity suited them. She had been treating it as a supplemental crop, useful but peripheral. Edmund described the nutritional role of fungal protein in diets that lack consistent access to meat, and he described the specific substrate combinations, the ratio of fresh wood chips to the established mycelium culture, that would increase yield per log by a factor she had not thought possible. He had encountered it, he said, in a paper published by an agricultural researcher at a Midwestern university, which he had read in a technical journal that arrived 4 months late through a mail forwarding arrangement he maintained with a bookseller in Nashville. She asked him once why he read so broadly in all the years he had been living alone on the mountain, with nothing practical requiring him to know about mushroom cultivation or agricultural research. He was quiet for a moment. Then, knowledge doesn't need a reason waiting for it. That's not how it works. You accumulate it because the world is interesting and because you cannot know in advance which part of what you've learned will turn out to be the piece that fits. He paused. You already know this. You've known it since you were old enough to read a fertilizer label. She wrote it in the almanac, not because she was sentimental about it, but because it was true, and she wanted to have it in a form she could return to. Edmund Hale died on the 23rd of January, 1939. She had been with him every day for the previous 6 weeks, coming down from the cave in the afternoons and staying until dark, bringing food from her stores, and in the last 2 weeks staying the night in the loft above his front room, so she was close enough to hear if he needed anything. He was not a man who asked for things, but in those last weeks he seemed to accept her presence as something other than intrusion, which she understood as its own form of asking. She read to him in the evenings from the engineering textbook stacked beside his bed, technical prose not comfortable by most standards, but he listened to it the way other people listen to music, the specific pleasure of a mind encountering its own language. He died in the night quietly in the way that people who have made their peace with a thing tend to do it, not fighting the conclusion, but simply reaching the end of the sentence. Clara found him in the morning. She sat with him for a while before she did anything else in the way she had come to understand was necessary, the ritual acknowledgement that a person had been present and was now not, and that this required a moment of recognition before the practical world resumed. The will was 1 page. Edmund had written it himself in the angular, pressured hand of a man trained to produce legible technical documents. It left the cabin, the adjacent land, the tools, the books, and every other item of his property to Clara Voss. The language was unambiguous, the legal form correct. He had been a meticulous man, and he had applied his meticulousness to dying as he had applied it to everything else. The final line read, "To Clara Voss, who proved that the best engineering is done with seeds." She arranged for his burial through the county office in the valley below, an interaction she handled by written correspondence rather than in person, and she returned to the mountain afterward and sat for a long time in the main chamber, with the light columns moving over the wheat on the terraces and the stream running its steady course along the far wall, and she thought about what it meant to have been known accurately by someone who was no longer there to know you. The cabin and the land gave her something she had not had since October 1934, a legal address, a place the county had to acknowledge she existed and had rights in. The lawyer handling the estate recorded the transfer in the county records as was required, and within 2 weeks, Clara received an inquiry from the county tax assessor's office regarding the property valuation. The inquiry was bureaucratically phrased and technically legitimate, and she understood immediately that it was neither of those things at its origin. She responded in writing, citing the relevant statute regarding estate transfers, using language she had found in one of Edmund's legal reference books, and she filed the response through a notary in the town of Marion, 40 miles east, rather than through Granger County's office. The assessment was not pursued further. By 1940, the cave system she was working had expanded to 4 connected chambers. She was 20 years old, and her hands had the permanent calluses of someone who had been doing manual labor in a confined, damp space for 5 years, and her eyes had the particular quality of attention of someone who has spent those years reading small things carefully: the color of soil, the angle of light, the sound of water. Her annual grain production exceeded 1,000 pounds. Her network of families using cave growing methods across 3 mountain communities numbered 15, and she managed it the way Edmund had managed his knowledge, by distribution, by giving the methods away as fast as she developed them, because hoarded knowledge does not compound and shared knowledge does. She learned to read the mountain's hydrology the way Edmund had learned to read mine systems, by paying close attention over time to things that most people did not think were legible: the underground stream's behavior through the seasons, the variation in cave temperature across different sections of the chambers in response to outside conditions, the way the humidity shifted in the days before a significant weather change, the cave breathing slightly differently when the barometric pressure outside changed, a phenomenon she could feel in the quality of the air against her skin before any other sign appeared. In the spring of 1941, she noticed that the underground stream was running fractionally lower than it had run at the same time the previous year and the year before that. She had the almanac data going back to 1934, and she laid it out in columns and looked at the numbers, and the numbers told a story that did not yet have a name. The water table was dropping. Not dramatically, not in a way that would concern someone who was not measuring it in the particular way she was measuring it, but dropping. She stepped outside the cave on a morning in late April and looked at the sky, and then at the valley below, and then at the long line of the horizon to the southwest, where weather came from in this part of Tennessee. The sky was clear in the way that some skies are clear, not the clarifying, clean-washed clear that follows good rain, but the hard, bright clear of a sky that has nothing in it and intends to keep it that way. She went back into the cave and began counting her stores. Not in the casual way of someone taking inventory, but in the precise way of someone running a calculation that has a specific answer she needed to know. She counted pounds of wheat flour, pounds of root vegetables in the deep chamber storage, the dried mushrooms in their hanging bundles, the seed stalks in their sealed cans. She wrote the numbers down. She calculated the rate at which she had been distributing food to the 15 families in her network, and she recalculated that rate under the assumption that the stream's behavior was the first sign of something larger coming. Then she pulled back from the informal distribution system she had built up over the previous 2 years, redirecting that food to storage while continuing to supply only the families with the most urgent need, those with young children and those whose own cave gardens were still in the early stages. She told no one why. It seemed premature, and the cost of being wrong about this in the direction of alarm would be the trust she had built over 5 years with the families on the North Slope. So she stored quietly and said nothing, and watched the stream level drop through May and June at a rate that told her she had not been wrong. By July, the creek outside the cave entrance was running low enough to walk across in the shallow sections. The sky to the southwest stayed hard and bright and empty. The valley below did not yet understand what was coming. She could see the fields from the high section of the trail above the cave entrance, green still in early July, the crops not yet showing the stress that came with sustained heat and no water. The farmers working their rows with the ordinary optimism of people who have not yet been shown what that particular summer intended to do. She stood on the trail on a morning in the second week of July and looked down at the valley and felt something that was not satisfaction. She took no comfort in having seen this coming when others had not, but rather the particular weight of knowing something that will not remain private much longer, the precursor to a responsibility she had not chosen and could not now refuse. She went back into the cave and planted the fastest maturing varieties she had in the sections she had been resting through the spring. Then she went to the deep storage chamber and reorganized everything by caloric density, calculating how many people a given weight of flour or dried grain would feed for a day, and she stacked and labeled accordingly. She was ready before the valley knew it needed her to be. 67 days without significant rain. That was what July and August and most of September brought to Granger County in the summer of 1941. The temperature stayed above 90 degrees for stretches of 10 and 12 days without variation. The creek beds went dry. The wells dropped to the point where families were hauling water from the deeper river channels by wagon, rationing it between drinking and animals. The corn went first, the leaves curling inward and turning the pale yellow-green of something giving up the ears not forming on the stalks. The bean crop failed in August. The tobacco lasted into September before it broke, and when it broke, it went quickly. The underground stream in the cave never stopped running. It slowed running at perhaps 40% of its winter volume, but it ran because it was fed by a water table deep enough in the limestone to be buffered against a single season's surface drought, the same geological formation that had made the Voss family's spring the most valuable water feature in the northern part of the county, the same formation that Sheriff Dale Mercer had wanted to control and had believed he'd controlled when he took the land. The water was still there. It was just no longer where he had put it. In the third week of August, Clara was on the upper terrace of the main chamber when she heard voices outside the cave entrance. She moved quietly to the passage and listened. Two women's voices, uncertain, calling out in the way that people call out when they are not sure what they are approaching. She went out through the sumac curtain. There were four women, Mrs. Fowler she knew. The other three she recognized as women from the valley below. She had seen them at the county market years before when she was still the Voss girl who came in with her father to sell tobacco. They were standing in a group at the edge of the trail with the posture of people who have climbed further than they expected to climb and are not entirely sure what they have arrived at. The oldest of them, a woman with gray at her temples, who held herself with the particular dignity of someone who is accustomed to being the one who does the organizing, stepped slightly forward. She said she was Mrs. Sutton. Clara looked at her. Mrs. Sutton, who had brought biscuits to the Voss porch on the morning of the eviction and had not looked her in the eye. Mrs. Sutton, who had said she was sorry from the safety of her own porch while Clara walked away down the road. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then, "Did you bring something to carry food in on?" Mrs. Sutton blinked. She had not expected this to be the first question. She held up a canvas sack. The other three women held up what they had brought, two more canvas sacks, a wooden crate, a large pot. Clara looked at what they had and calculated quickly what it would hold. Then she turned and went back through the sumac curtain without saying anything further, and after a moment she heard them follow. She loaded them with 200 pounds of wheat flour, divided into manageable weights, 50 pounds of potatoes, turnips, and beets in the wooden crate, dried mushrooms packed in paper. She worked systematically the way she had always worked, and the women watched her and said little, except to offer to carry and to lift. When everything was loaded, Mrs. Sutton stood in the entrance to the main chamber and looked at the terraces in the light from the south wall openings. She looked at them for a long time. Clara told them to come back the following Saturday and to tell anyone who was hungry to come and to bring something to carry food in. She said it plainly as a practical instruction without the grandeur of a declaration, because it was not a declaration. It was the next thing to do. Mrs. Sutton turned from the terraces and looked at Clara with an expression that was trying to say several things at once and succeeding at none of them. Clara met her eyes steadily. Go, her voice without sharpness, just the simple word of someone who had more to do before dark. The children in the valley need to eat. The Saturdays began. Clara had not planned them as a system. They emerged from the logic of the situation, the way most necessary things emerge, not from design, but from the pressure of circumstance, meeting the available capacity to respond. The first Saturday brought 11 people to the base of Buckhorn Mountain. The second brought 23. By the third Saturday of September, the number had grown to something she could no longer count from where she stood at the cave entrance, loading sacks, and she stopped trying to count and focused instead on the distribution moving through the line with the efficiency of someone who has calculated the weight of each parcel against the stores remaining and knows exactly how far the food can stretch without breaking. She did not make speeches. She had nothing to say that the bread and the potatoes and the dried mushrooms did not say more plainly. She handed each person or family their parcel and told them to come back the following Saturday, and they went back down the mountain and carrying what she had given them, and she went back into the cave and began preparing the next week's distribution. She was drawing down her stored reserves at a rate she had calculated as sustainable through October, assuming the drought broke by then. If it did not break by October, she would need to begin rationing the distribution more severely, making decisions about which families receive priority, the most caloric need first, the children first, within that, the rest in whatever order presented itself. She ran the numbers every week alone in the deep storage chamber, with the almanac open and the candle lit, adjusting the following Saturday's parcel weights accordingly. What she had not calculated for was Mercer. He came on a Tuesday in the second week of September, which was not a Saturday, which meant he came alone and on purpose, and without the cover of the general population that had been making the mountain climb each week. She was in the main chamber extending the irrigation channel on the uppermost terrace when she heard the brush at the cave entrance move, not the tentative, uncertain movement of someone who did not know what they were approaching, but the deliberate movement of someone who had decided to enter. She set down the hoe and stood up and turned. Dale Mercer was 61 years old and had the build of a man who had been physically imposing in his 40s and had since replaced the muscle with something denser and less identifiable, the accumulated weight of decades of authority exercised without resistance. He was not in uniform. He wore plain work clothes and carried no visible indication of his office, which she understood was itself a kind of message that he had come here not as the law, but as something that did not need the law to make itself felt. He stopped inside the entrance and let his eyes adjust to the cave's light, and she watched him look at the 20 terraces of wheat and rye, and the root vegetable rows visible through the passage to the second chamber, and the mushroom logs stacked along the east wall, and the irrigation channels running their quiet, gravity-fed courses from level to level. Then he looked at Clara standing in her work clothes with the short hoe in her hand, and the particular quality of stillness, of someone who has decided not to be the first person to speak. He was the first person to speak. I didn't expect to find this, the words arriving, without the authority that would have accompanied them 7 years ago, something in them that was not quite admission, but was adjacent to it, the sound of a man encountering a gap between what he had assumed and what existed. Clara looked at him steadily. The last time she had been in his presence, she had been 14 years old, and standing on the porch of her family's house, watching him not quite look at her from the back of a wagon. She was 21 years old now, and the intervening years had made her considerably less interested in the performance of confrontation. She had work to do, and he was standing in it. Did you come to take something, her voice level without heat, or did you come to understand something? He walked further into the chamber, not toward her, but toward the south wall, toward the light columns falling across the first terrace. He stood in one of them and looked up through the opening at the strip of sky above. He reached out and touched the wheat on the nearest terrace row, a brief contact, the back of one finger against the grain, heads, the gesture of someone touching something to confirm it is real. He pulled his hand back. I've had your family's land for 7 years. His voice lower now, losing some of the compression that authority gives to speech. And I have never gotten that land to do what your father got it to do. Not close. He paused. The admission had cost him something. She could see it cost him something. I knew what I was doing when I filed the claim. I want you to understand that I know that. Clara set the hoe against the terrace border. He was not asking for forgiveness, and she was not offering it. What was happening between them was something more functional than forgiveness. It was two people acknowledging the shape of a thing that had happened, which was different from resolving it and different from ignoring it, and was in some ways more durable than either. She walked to the deep storage section of the second chamber and came back with a cloth sack containing 10 pounds of potatoes and 5 pounds of wheat flour. She set it on the cave floor at his feet. Your family needs to eat, her voice carrying the same weight it carried when she said it to anyone else, neither more nor less. He looked at the sack. He did not immediately pick it up. She turned and went back to the terrace and picked up the hoe and resumed what she had been doing, which was the clearest possible signal that the conversation had reached its conclusion. After a moment, she heard him pick up the sack. She heard his footsteps move toward the entrance. He stopped once, and she heard him stop, and she kept working, and then his footsteps resumed, and he went through the sumac curtain and out onto the mountain. She did not stop working. Councilman Roy Garrett came the following Thursday alone and on foot climbing the mountain with the unhurried reluctance of a man who has been building toward a difficult thing for a long time and has finally run out of reasons to delay it. He was 63 years old and had sat on the Granger County Board for 12 years and had the particular exhaustion of a man who has made a wrong decision and has been living inside the consequences of it ever since. He stood in front of Clara in the cave entrance with his hat in both hands and the expression of someone attempting to locate words for something that has no comfortable vocabulary. She waited. I signed the papers, the words coming out in the flat, declarative way of someone who has rehearsed them enough that they no longer sound rehearsed, just honest, on your family's property. The tax claim. I sat on the board that approved Mercer's filing, and I knew the valuation was false, and I approved it because I owed Dale Mercer $400 and I didn't have it. He stopped. His hands worked the brim of the hat. I have carried that every day since your father died. I want you to know that I have carried it every day. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost a man of his age and position to climb a mountain and say that to a young woman who had every right to refuse him the dignity of an audience. She went to the storage section and came back with a sack of potatoes. She held it out to him, then put it down. Her voice without ceremony, the simplest possible instruction, the kind of thing you say to someone who is holding something heavy and needs to be told they are allowed to set it on the ground. He took the sack. He held it for a moment with both arms the way you hold something you're not sure you deserve to receive, and then he nodded once to himself more than to her and turned and went down the mountain. Mrs. Mercer came on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks into October. She came alone, wearing a dress that was clean and carefully pressed and entirely unsuited to mountain climbing, and she had climbed anyway, which told Clara something about the weight of what she had come to say. She stood at the cave entrance with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes red at the edges in the way of someone who has been composing themselves for a difficult conversation and has not entirely succeeded. She told Clara that her husband had taken the Voss land. She said she had known at the time that it was wrong and had said nothing, and that the not saying had lived in her ever since. She said she was sorry in the plain, undecorated way of someone who has decided that elaboration is a form of self-indulgence they no longer have access to. Clara looked at her. Mercer's wife had not signed any papers. She had not filed any claims or attended any proceedings or done anything except live with a man who had and understand what he was doing and remain silent. This was not a small thing. It was also not the same thing as what Garrett had done or what Mercer had done, and Clara had sufficient precision of thought to keep those distinctions clear. She went to storage and came back with a sack of flour and held it out. Your children need to eat too. The words carrying no extra weight, no architecture of meaning beyond their surface sense, which was sufficient. Mrs. Mercer took the flour. She was crying quietly and without apparent self-consciousness, and she looked at Clara with the expression of someone encountering a response that is at once simpler and more difficult to bear than the one they had prepared for. She started to say something more and then seemed to decide against it, which was the right decision, and she turned and went back down the mountain. October brought rain. Not immediately and not all at once, but beginning in the first week with a series of afternoon thunderstorms that moved through the valley from the southwest and dropped 2 inches over 3 days, and continued from there in a pattern of irregular but consistent precipitation that told anyone who knew how to read weather that the drought had broken. The creek outside the cave entrance ran fast within a week. The underground stream rose back toward its normal volume over the following 2 weeks, the water table recharging from the rains with the slow, reliable deliberateness of limestone hydrology. The valley's crops were gone. The corn and beans and tobacco had failed entirely, and there was nothing to be done about that until the following spring's planting. But the families who had been coming up the mountain every Saturday had stores, now not abundant stores, not the kind of winter provisions that a full harvest would have provided, but enough to bridge. Clara's calculations told her she had approximately 6 more weeks of distribution at the current parcel weights before her stores would reach the minimum level she needed to maintain seed stock and personal provision through the winter. The rain arrived with 2 of those weeks still in reserve. She continued the Saturday distributions through October and into November at reduced parcel weights until it became clear that the families in the valley had begun to reestablish their own provisions through the county relief programs the state had sent in response to the drought reports, and through the networks of mutual assistance that communities activate when the emergency is undeniable. By November, the Mountain Saturdays had transformed from crisis response into something more sustainable and less urgent, families coming not from desperation, but from a recognition that the exchange of goods and knowledge with the woman on Buckhorn Mountain was worth the climb for reasons that persisted beyond the emergency that had created the habit. Mercer lost the 1942 election by a margin that removed any ambiguity about what the county had decided. He received 31% of the vote against James Calloway, who had come back from 2 years of federal service with the particular directness of a man who had seen several kinds of institutional corruption and had developed a considered intolerance for all of them. Calloway was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with a quality of attention that reminded Clara the first time she met him of Edmund, not the same kind of intelligence, but the same habit of looking at a situation until he understood it, rather than until he had identified the response that was most convenient. He came to the mountain in January of 1943. He came officially with a written notice of inquiry regarding the 1934 tax claim on the Voss property, and he came alone, which told her he was treating this as a matter of record rather than a matter of power. He sat in Edmund's cabin, hers now in the legal sense, though she still thought of it as Edmund's in the sense that mattered, and he laid out what his initial review of the county records had found the valuation applied to the Voss property in the tax claim differed from the methodology applied to comparable properties in the same tax year. The difference was not marginal. It was the kind of difference that required explanation, and the explanation the records provided was thin in the specific way of a document that has been constructed to survive a casual review rather than a detailed one. She told him what she knew. She told him about the lawyer's letter she had received in the summer of 1934, which she had kept. The letter was in the almanac, folded and refolded along its creases until the paper had softened to the texture of cloth, but the ink still legible, the careful legal language still pointing in its precise way at the thing it was not quite naming. She gave him the letter. He read it twice and set it on the table between them. "This is going to take time," his voice carrying no apology for the time it would take, just the acknowledgement of it, the honest accounting of what the process required. "The county recorder's office has records going back to 1928, and someone is going to need to go through all of them. It may take 2 years." She told him she had been waiting 9 years. 2 more was a number she could work with. He came back regularly through 1943 and into 1944, not always with official business, sometimes with questions about the cave farming operation that had nothing to do with the legal investigation and everything to do with the fact that he had become genuinely interested in what she had built. He brought a researcher from the state agricultural office on one visit, a young woman named Patterson, who took extensive notes and asked questions of a technical specificity that told Clara she had actually read the relevant literature before coming. Clara answered everything Patterson asked and gave her copies of the hand-transcribed pages from the bulletin and the notes from the almanac that described the terrace system's design principles. Patterson published a report 6 months later through the State Extension Service. It described in the careful language of agricultural science a system of subterranean cultivation developed in Granger County, Tennessee, using principles of thermal mass management, natural light direction, and controlled irrigation within karst limestone cave systems. It cited a practitioner identified as C. Voss of Buckhorn Mountain as the originator of the methods. Clara read the report and found it accurate and somewhat bloodless, the way official documents tend to be accurate and bloodless, stripping the living texture from the things they describe in order to make them transferable. She did not object to this. Transferable was the point. The county court ruling came in March of 1944, delivered by a circuit judge who had been brought in from outside Granger County specifically because the case involved the conduct of the county's own recent administration. The ruling was 9 pages long, and Clara read every word of it slowly, the way she read anything that mattered. It found that the 1934 tax assessment of the Voss property had been conducted using a non-standard valuation methodology not authorized under the applicable statute. It found that the timing of the claims filing 48 hours after the property owner's death, combined with the documented relationship between the filing official and subsequent purchasers of the property, constituted sufficient evidence of fraudulent intent to vacate the original judgment. It ordered the return of the property to the estate of Thomas and Eleanor Voss, represented by their surviving heir. It was 40 acres of south-facing slope above a creek that ran year-round over a water table that had never gone dry in recorded memory. It was the barn her grandfather had built, and the house her parents had died in, and the 12 dogwood trees her mother had planted with a measuring rope the year Clara was born. She went back to the land on a Saturday in April, alone in the early morning, before the light had fully established itself over the valley. She walked the dirt road from the county office in town, and she walked it as the sun came up the road familiar, in the way that things are familiar when you have known them since before you were old enough to know you were knowing them. The house needed work. 7 years of intermittent tenancy had left it serviceable, but not tended. The porch boards had gone soft in 2 places. The barn roof had a section that would not last another winter. And the kitchen garden her mother had kept in the side yard had gone entirely to volunteer plants and crabgrass. None of this was what she had come to see. She stood in front of the dogwood trees. They were larger than she remembered, which she should have anticipated and somehow had not. They had been saplings when her mother planted them, and they were now, 21 years later, the confident adults they had been growing toward, all along their canopies, touching where Eleanor Voss had calculated they would eventually touch. They were not yet in full bloom. April in this part of Tennessee could go either way, and this April had been cool, but the buds were tight and white at the tips of every branch days away from opening. She had not permitted herself to look at them in October of 1934, when she walked away from this house for what she had understood might be the last time. She stood now and looked at them for as long as she needed to, which was a long time, and she did not manage it without crying, and she had not expected to manage it without crying. The crying was not grief, in the same way the crying on the cave floor in January of 1935 had not been grief. It was the emotion that has no single name, the one that arrives when a distance finally closes, when the shape of a loss and the shape of a return are held in the mind simultaneously, and the space between them becomes briefly painfully visible. She stayed on the land through the morning. She walked the 40 acres the way her father had walked them on Sunday mornings, methodically from the creek boundary north to the fence line, east to the limestone outcropping that marked the corner south along the slope. The soil was still good. You could feel it in the way it gave underfoot, not the compacted, defeated ground of mistreated farmland, but the springy, layered resilience of earth that has been resting. She did not move back. Edmund's cabin on the north face of Buckhorn was her home in the sense that actually governed the place where she had built her life, where her work was, where the cave was, where she had become whatever she had become in the years since October 1934. The Voss land was hers in the legal sense, and she intended to maintain it and eventually to farm it again. And she understood that it would take years before she decided exactly how. Some decisions do not need to be forced to their conclusions. James Calloway proposed to her in the cabin in the spring of 1945. He did it without the architecture of a formal occasion. He came for supper, which had become a regular practice over the previous year. And after supper, he said what he had apparently been deciding how to say for some time, which was that he had found in his 33 years that the things he valued most were specific rather than general, and that the most specific thing he had found in those years was her, and he would like if she was willing to build something alongside her. She was willing. She chose the cave entrance for the ceremony in May, when the light coming through the south wall openings fell in the particular way it fell in late spring, longer columns, lower angle, the gold of them richer than in winter. She chose it because she had told Calloway once that the cave was where her life had begun again, and she had meant it in the specific unrhetorical sense that the person she was had been built there in the dark, in the cold, and the silence of a mountain that had given her exactly nothing except the conditions in which she could build something herself. They had 4 children. The oldest was a girl named Eleanor, which required no explanation. The second was a boy named Thomas. The third and fourth were named for no one in particular, which Clara considered appropriate. Not every life needed to be dedicated to the past. Some could simply be themselves. All 4 of them grew up knowing the cave the way most children know their backyards, with the casual intimacy of daily familiarity, and all 4 of them learned to read a terrace grade before they were 10 and to identify soil composition by texture and color before they finished primary school. Clara taught them the way Edmund had taught her, not from a curriculum, but from the ongoing practice of the work, answering the questions that arose from doing, rather than anticipating questions and preparing answers in advance. She expanded her correspondence with the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Department through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, an exchange that had begun with Patterson's visit and grown into a sustained collaboration with two researchers who were genuinely trying to understand what she had developed rather than simply describe it. She sent them detailed written accounts of her methods, her observations about soil chemistry and light sufficiency and moisture management, the failures as well as the successes. A blight that took the mushroom crop entirely in 1947, a drainage failure in the third chamber in 1950 that required 2 months of reconstruction, a seed stock contamination in 1952 that cost her a growing season on 2 terraces. She sent them all of it because she understood that the failures were the most useful part. Anyone could describe a method that worked. The researcher's job was to understand why it worked when it did and why it failed when it didn't. And that understanding required the complete record, not the edited one. The researchers published 4 papers over the course of a decade in journals that reached people Clara would never meet in places she would never visit. And those papers carried her methods into contexts she had not designed for arid environments. Different cave geologies, growing conditions in parts of the country where the limestone karst of Appalachia was not available, but where some of the underlying principles applied to alternative substrates. She read everything they sent her and wrote back with comments that were sometimes corrections. They learned to take the corrections seriously. She drove to Washington in the spring of 1963 in the truck Callaway had bought the previous year, wearing her best dress and the work boots she wore for everything, because she owned 1 pair of boots, and they were good ones. The subcommittee hearing on rural food security in Appalachia had been convened by a senator from Ohio who had been moved to action by the federal poverty surveys of the previous year, surveys that had produced numbers shocking enough to penetrate the comfortable distance that legislators typically maintained from the conditions of rural poverty. The hearing room was paneled in dark wood and smelled of coffee and air conditioning and the particular staleness of spaces that are used exclusively for the performance of civic importance. She sat at the witness table and set the loaf of bread in front of her and looked at the 7 senators arrayed on the dais. The loaf had been baked the morning before she left Tennessee from flour ground from wheat grown on the 4th terrace of the main chamber of the Buckhorn Cave System, which was in its 29th year of continuous production. She had wrapped it in a clean cloth and carried it on the truck seat beside her for 8 hours, and it was still by any reasonable standard bread. She had prepared remarks because the subcommittee required prepared remarks, and she had written them in the almanac and then transcribed them to clean paper. But she did not read from them. She said what she had come to say the way she had always communicated anything important directly, precisely, without the softening that people sometimes applied to difficult truths in the hope of making them more acceptable to the people who needed to act on them but preferred not to. This bread was grown inside a mountain, the words landing in the room without drama, the flat Tennessee cadence of someone stating a fact before drawing a conclusion, by a woman who was told she had nothing and nowhere to go. She paused. She looked at the senator from Ohio who had asked the most substantive questions in the preliminary exchange. If I could do what I did with a cave and some seeds and 3 books, imagine what your programs could accomplish if they were designed by the people who need them, instead of the people who've decided what those people need. She pushed the bread toward the center of the table. You should eat some of that. 2 of the senators did eat some of it. One of them, the senior senator from Tennessee, who had been visibly uncomfortable for most of her testimony, ate a piece and said it was good bread. She said it was. He asked how long it took to learn to grow wheat underground. She told him 5 years to do it adequately and a lifetime to do it well, which was true of most things worth doing. The subcommittee incorporated several of her specific recommendations into their report published in the fall of 1963, which influenced the rural development provisions of legislation that followed over the next several years. She did not take credit for this. She had offered information and the committee had used some of it, which was the best available outcome and better than she had expected. Callaway died in 1979, a heart attack in the early morning in the cabin, which was where he would have chosen to be. He was 67 years old and had served as county sheriff for 16 years and had spent the remaining time farming the Voss land, which he had come to love, with the specific devotion of someone who has come to a place late and understands what it costs to be there. He died with the particular completeness of a man who had done what he set out to do, which was not everything, but was not nothing. She stayed on the mountain. She was 59 years old, and her children were grown, and the grandchildren were beginning to appear at intervals. And she was, by every external measure, a woman who had earned the right to reduce the scale of her ambitions. She did not reduce the scale of her ambitions. She expanded the written record of her methods, the accumulation of 45 years of observation and adjustment and failure and recovery, into a document that eventually ran to several hundred handwritten pages. Her children after her death would spend 2 years transcribing and organizing it before donating it to the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Library, where it would be cataloged under her name and consulted by researchers for decades. She also, in her 60s, began making visits to communities across the Appalachian region, not to teach in the formal sense, but to look at what people were doing and to answer specific questions and to leave behind in each place the seed stocks and the written method as summaries, and the confidence that the approach was portable, that the principles worked in other cave systems if you understood what the principles actually were and as opposed to what they appeared to be. The network of cave farms she had established in the 3 mountain communities north of Granger County continued to function and in several cases had been formalized into small cooperative arrangements, families pooling their growing capacity and distributing through shared storage. She had not designed these arrangements. She had given people the tools, and the people had designed the arrangements that suited their situations, which was the correct outcome. The sign that knowledge had genuinely transferred was when the people who received it did things with it you hadn't imagined. She died on the 7th of March, 1993. She was 73 years old, and she had been in the cabin for 3 months by then, her oldest daughter, Eleanor, managing the daily practicalities with the same quiet competence that Clara had always recognized in her as a quality that came from somewhere older than either of them. The mountain was visible from every window of the cabin. On clear days, she could see the section of the cliff face above the cave entrance, the pale limestone distinct against the sky. She had asked Eleanor to leave the curtains open, and Eleanor had left them open. Granger County flew its flag at half-staff for 3 days. The elementary school, which had been named for her in 1971 after a vote of the county board, a vote that had passed unanimously, which struck Clara at the time as the most specific form of institutional irony she had ever encountered, closed for a day of observation. The Harvest Festival, which had been running since 1955 and had become one of the county's primary annual gatherings, dedicated that year's edition to her memory with a display in the town square featuring the original almanac open to the page where she had written on the 19th of January, 1935, the first 2 sentences of the day's entry. The cave continued to be farmed. Her son Thomas had managed the operation for the previous decade and continued to do so, and his daughter Clara's granddaughter, named Agnes, for the teacher who had given the book, was studying agricultural science at the University of Tennessee and would complete her degree the following year and return to Buckhorn Mountain with a set of technical skills that the original operation could not have imagined and a practical grounding in what the cave required that she had been building since she was old enough to walk the terraces without being carried. The University of Tennessee's Agricultural Extension Program established the Clara Voss Fellowship in 2001, funded by a combination of state allocation and private donations from families across the Appalachian region, many of whom had connections, direct or indirect, to the mountain communities where Clara's methods had taken root. The fellowship supported research into alternative growing environments, cave systems, controlled underground spaces, high-altitude enclosures, and the researchers it supported worked in a field that had not existed as a formal discipline before a 14-year-old girl in 1934 had looked at a cave and seen what was already there. The plaque at the cave entrance was placed in 2005 after a fundraising effort organized by a coalition of families from 6 counties. It was set into the limestone of the cave entrance at eye-level bronze on pale gray stone, the text decided by a committee that had argued for 6 months about what it should say and had eventually arrived at the words by the process of elimination, crossing out everything that seemed to require the plaque to be more than it was, until what remained was only what was true. It said Clara Voss found this cave in 1934. She was 14 years old alone and had nothing. She turned it into a farm that fed a county and changed a way of life. The light was always here. She was the first one to use it. People came to read it from considerable distances. They came because the story had traveled the way useful stories travel, not through the channels designed for broadcasting, but through the channels designed for conversation. Person to person, each telling slightly different from the last. But the core of it, stable, resistant to distortion, because the core was simple enough to survive retelling. A girl with nothing. A scientific seeds. Work done in the dark for years without the audience that makes most people willing to keep working. And then the thing she built was the only thing standing when everything else failed, and the people who had watched her lose everything came up the mountain with empty sacks, and she filled them without a speech and told them to come back next week. What remained past the plaque and the fellowship in the school with her name on it, past the papers in the agricultural journals, and the document in the university library, and the network of cave farms still operating in communities that had forgotten if they ever knew exactly where the method had come from, what remained was the thing itself, the cave. The terraces maintained and expanded but structurally continuous with the ones she had built in the winter of 1934, the stone borders Edmund had specified still in place under the additions of subsequent decades. The irrigation channels running their quiet, gravity-fed courses from level to level, the water moving exactly as she had calculated it would move in doing so still. The light coming through the south wall openings, 4 columns of it in winter, broader and more numerous in the longer days, falling across the growing medium, the way it had fallen since before there was anyone there to notice it or use it. Falling in the particular way of light that has traveled through mica-bearing limestone and arrived in a dark place richer for the journey, carrying more than it started with, which is not a metaphor and is not a lesson, and is simply what light does when it passes through the right kind of stone. She had seen it on a cold October afternoon in 1934, barefoot on the mountain with nothing in her rucksack but 3 books and some beans and a knife, and she had stood in it and understood what it was and what it was for, and she had not waited for permission or resources or a better time or a more forgiving world. She had taken what was in front of her, and she had begun.